Welcome to Meant to Be, the Bible's best kept secrets about sex, marriage, and being single. This series is based upon 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It's actually a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. And in chapter 7, he's going to deal with these three topics, sex, marriage, and being single, because they were things that Paul needed to encourage the church with back then. Those three issues are still prevalent in the church today. So we're going to learn a lot from what Paul had to tell the church back then and apply it to our lives today. And that's where the e-group discussion comes in, is we're gonna dig deep into these issues. There's a tendency in our Christian faith to actually avoid the topic of sex and relationships because they can become taboo or awkward to talk about. And that's why we as a church are not called to lean away from these topics. We're actually called to lean into them. Because when we have discussions about this, we bring Jesus into the center of it. We're gonna look at three biblical principles in this discussion that's gonna help guide the conversation to see what Jesus would have us to learn about sex, marriage, and relationships. And the first biblical principle is this: sex, marriage, and being single are gifts from God. The Bible actually says that every good and perfect gift comes from above. And so everything that we can enjoy in life is a gift that God has given us. Marriage and sex and being single are three of those things. And so in the beginning, God created Adam and Eve, and he created them to be husband and wife and to enjoy everything that a husband and wife should have together in that marriage, with sex being one of those. So in chapter 7, when Paul begins writing, he says, it is not good for man to have sexual relation with a woman. He's not condemning the act of sex. What he's actually doing is laying out a framework and some boundaries to help establish it so that we protect the gift that God has given us. And every gift that God gives us is intended to be a blessing to our lives. But when we don't have the right perspective, when we don't see it as a gift, it can actually become a burden. And that's one of the hardest parts about running after God. It's to embrace the gifts that he's given us. And so in this series, in the discussion, we want to talk about, how do I continue to have focus on the blessing, seeing it as a gift, rather than letting it become a burden? One of the things that will help us to continue to keep seeing God's gifts as blessings and not burdens is when we set up healthy boundaries in our lives. And so that brings us to principle number 2. God's not trying to keep anything from us. He's trying to protect something for us. In every season of life, there are a set of responsibilities that go with it. There's blessings and burdens in every single season of life. But what the enemy tries to do, he tries to convince you that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. That if you could just be someplace that you're not, it would be better when you get there. But God tells us we need to water the grass in whatever season of life we're in. I remember for me, when I was single, I used to feel like I was cursed. I used to feel like, man, God, what did I do? Are you mad at me if I disappointed you because I'm single and I don't want to be single anymore? But I heard God speaking to me in that place. He said, you're not cursed. You actually have the potential of having great blessing in your life right now. And so for me, when I stopped seeing it as a curse and started being single as being a blessing, my life changed. Because what I was able to do, and the blessing that God wanted me to enjoy, is to give most of my focus and attention to him. Seeing how I could grow in him, how I could grow through him, but also how God could use me to change other people's lives. And in that place, in that season of being single, I was able to have greater influence and impact in other people's lives because that season allowed for it. But when I was seeing it as a curse, I wasn't living in that place. I wasn't embracing it. And the third biblical principle we're going to talk about today is this: it's not what you've done, it's where you're going. Because the beauty of the relationship that we have with Jesus Christ is that no matter how many times we make a mistake, no matter how many times we sin, God is faithful to forgive us every single time. And if you've made a mistake, if you have messed up this part of your life, there's good news today, because Jesus Christ can forgive you. He wants to forgive you because he wants you to move you on towards the gifts that are waiting for you. Because your past mistakes don't disqualify God's gifts in your life. And he wants you to get up today. He wants you to move on and run towards the gifts he has waiting for you. But he wants you to do it with intelligence. He wants you to do it with establishing healthy boundaries. Because the reality is, most husbands and wives in their marriages, the most difficult thing to talk about are issues of intimacy and sex. It's often the thing that gets neglected the most in a relationship. And it's that thing below the surface that husbands and wives never really talk about, but it's a tension that is always there. And we want to challenge husbands and wives and e-groups during this discussion to really go there, to really go to the place of having honest dialogue about the frustrations you're facing and the struggles you're encountering. And for the single folks here, and for you in this season, just because you're not in a relationship right now doesn't mean you don't have any work to do. because often it's best to work on establishing these healthy boundaries before you ever find yourself in a relationship. So if you can do the hard work right now, have the hard discussions with your e-groups, begin building healthy boundaries, setting them in place now, you're gonna be able to protect the gift that God wants you to enjoy when you get into dating and when you get into marriage. So there's something for everybody in this discussion. And the challenge we want to give as a church family is, in this series, can we take a moment as a church family to have really good discussions, honest dialogue about the issues of sex, dating, and relationships. And we're believing that God is going to use this and He's going to transform countless lives along the way.